Welcome to What's New. Today we will be covering Greenland and Trump in the Arctic right now. And we have two experts, I would say, on Arctic geopolitics. Andreas, you've been a guest here before. You are a research director at the Group for Arctic and Ocean Politics. Erdem, Lamazhapov, PhD candidate. And you've been researching China in the Arctic, but also critical minerals, Russia, many of these things. So it's great to have both of you back here. So regarding Trump and Greenland in the Arctic, first of all, what does Trump really want in the Arctic with Greenland? What is his real ambitions? Is it to build this golden dome? Is it to get as much minerals as possible? What's the deal?
We can just speculate, right? Qualified guessing, I guess. And we can read the signals that are coming out of the White House, and we can also try to map what is actually happening in the Arctic and how does that correlate with what is being signaled from the White House. Personally, I think it's rather clear that this is not about minerals. This is not about Chinese or Russian naval vessels or ships all over the place, as he has alluded to. It is not even about securing the North American homeland or securing US territory. This is about wider great power ambitions from the United States. And it's about Donald Trump's personal interest in asserting power and maybe even just acquiring territory. And then you can use those other arguments, Russian and Chinese vessels, minerals, as a pretext for why you need Greenland. But in reality, if it was only about security or only about minerals, then you would have found other ways to accommodate those interests.
I agree with Andreas, and I think, I would probably maybe put a little bit more emphasis on the sphere of interest part of the whole debate, because the White House has made it abundantly clear that this is about the Western Hemisphere as this exclusive sphere of interest for the United States, where the United States will not tolerate any other great powers being present. And now both Russia and China have actually not been able to get any foothold in Greenland at all, but this greater, I guess, narrative about the American sphere of interest is probably more important here.
But they get everything they want from Greenland right now.
Yes, or maybe not everything in terms of what Donald Trump wants, but the US can have more military troops, more bases if they need to. They can have more security guarantees, whether it's from the Kingdom of Denmark or whether it's from NATO, the NATO alliance, or through their own efforts. They could probably also engage in more mineral activity if that was what this was really about. But what Erdem says here is rather important, right? The US or any large state, any great power, if you want to use that term, has always had spheres of influence, right? It's obvious that if you are a large country with a lot of power, you're interested in controlling what happens in your near abroad, in your immediate geographic vicinity. The US has always been worried about what happens with Cuba or the Panama Canal or Venezuela or Greenland for that matter. But it's the rhetoric that has changed, right? It's the effort that has changed. And it breaks with all the previous administrations' efforts to, yes, project power in the Western Hemisphere by all means, but also do this according to certain principles and uphold at least the notion and the idea of international law and self-determination by other people.
But going back to law and the legality of it all, because it is very clear it is within the current administration's interest to acquire Greenland, if by military means, then maybe even so be it. But what are the legal restrictions within US policy to do this? I mean, this still has to go through Congress. Is it said anywhere that they cannot invade Greenland, or can they maneuver around the current formulations and restrictions that are here now?
My understanding is that this would have to have approval from a wider circle than just Donald Trump and his friends and the vice president. I would assume that if Donald Trump actually wanted to use military force against Greenland or against nuke, first and foremost, is where you start if you use military force to acquire control of Greenland. If Donald Trump wanted to do so, he needs the support of Pentagon, of the Defense Department, and also the chiefs of the various branches of the US Armed Forces. I would also assume that these chiefs would tell him no, that this is actually attacking an ally. This is attacking an ally that we have had close cooperation with, that this move would lead to the fall of the NATO security alliance, and that such a move, because it would be so drastic to US security and US security approaches, that such a move would also need approval in Congress. And that he didn't seek before kidnapping the president of Venezuela. Okay, that was a limited operation police operation, even as he said, this would be something entirely different than Venezuela. And then I would assume that Congress would need to be involved, and then it requires then a more lengthy political discussion. And I would also assume that most in Congress would vote against this if they had the chance to vote. Donald Trump might be a mighty individual, and the US president is probably the most powerful man on earth, as people like to say, but he's still not a dictator.
So when it comes to going back to also the economic interests that the US has in Greenland, there's been some headlines about investments coming from the United States to Greenlandic critical minerals. But where are the critical minerals in Greenland? Are they easy to just access? How much of a potential is it there? And how much of a threat or interest does China have in these as well?
Yeah, so China has tried to invest in several critical minerals projects in Greenland. China hasn't been successful. There are two major deposits of rare earth elements that people usually talk about in the context of Greenland. One of them is Kvanefjell or Kvanersut deposit, and the second one is the Kringlerne deposit. Both of them are located in southern Greenland. They're very different deposits. So the first deposit, the Kvanefjell deposit, is a complex deposit which is also radioactive, and it contains uranium. So in order for that deposit to be mined, uranium also needs to be extracted. Now, uranium is both a critical mineral, but also a very scarce mineral globally. So there is a lot of demand for uranium, and it's also a very rich deposit in terms of rare earth concentration. However, the Greenlandic population has been against mining of uranium in Greenland. And this is how in 2021, during the election, this was the main case. And that's why in 2021, the Greenlandic law that banning uranium mining has been passed. And this is what has stopped this company, which had a stake from a Chinese company called Shenghe. This is how this was stopped. And now the case is being heard in the High Court of Greenland. Now, a couple of days ago, I guess late last year, the Danish court has thrown out the case because they said we don't have jurisdiction over what is happening in Greenland because mining is prerogative of Greenland. So it will be definitely heard in the Greenlandic court. We will see what will happen with the case. That aside, there is no license for mining uranium in Greenland. Feasibility study has shown that it will probably lead to some contamination, radioactive contamination, tailings, the stuff that is left over after ore beneficiation. It will also be radioactive. It has to be treated accordingly. The other mine, Kringlerne mine, is a different deposit. It's less rich comparatively in terms of rare earth concentration. It has a higher zirconium concentration. But this project is not radioactive. It's going ahead, and there is a US-backed company, Tabriz Minerals, that is going ahead with that project.
And they're currently going ahead with that project.
Yeah.
They have been for quite some time. So this is nothing new.
This is not new, no.
So they would have not. This current situation does not benefit them in any way.
That company.
The mining.
I cannot see how it would.
So, but if we go back to what the Greenlandic people want, I mean, there's been several polls and questionnaires, and the Greenlandic people have been very clear that they prefer not to be annexed by Trump and ideally be independent. Also, if they had to choose, Denmark is the way to go. When it comes to the Greenlandic people and Denmark, or Greenland and Denmark relations, they haven't quite been problem-free. I mean, we've heard the US administration using this as a narrative to push their own case ahead. But what are the current tensions between Denmark and Greenland, as we can see? Are they as significant as they're being portrayed as?
Again, none of us being from Denmark or from Greenland, the way we observe this as Arctic security scholars, I think the tension is perhaps a bit overstated. I think historically, yes, there's been a lot of tension. There's been a lot of mistreatment of the Greenlandic people by the Kingdom of Denmark. There's been all these different stories that have shown how certain atrocities were made against the indigenous population or the population of Greenland. But at the same time, Greenland has, over the last 2 decades, acquired more self-governance, has got more autonomy, decides more and more of its own policy areas itself. And it also seems that the Danish government in Copenhagen have been intent on trying to at least apologize or rectify for some of these treatments in the past. Then I guess you could probably always discuss, has the Danish government gone far enough? They already subsidize the functioning of Greenlandic society quite heavily, but could more have been done, both naturally throughout history, but also today? And we can discuss security, which is still something that is being decided by the government in Copenhagen and not by Nuuk. Has the Danish government neglected to invest sufficiently in security, as the Donald Trump administration argues? To some extent, you could say that that's a fair enough point, that the Kingdom of Denmark has not taken its security concerns in the Arctic seriously enough. But I also think that in the context of the Donald Trump rhetoric concerning Greenland, this division between Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, or Denmark itself, is a bit overblown and is probably used to try to create a wedge between the two entities. Whereas if you see the statement coming from the Prime Minister in Greenland, or you see polls coming from Greenland itself, most people still want to be part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Yes, independence is the long-term goal if economic independence is achieved. But at least at this moment, the desire is to stay with Denmark and not to leave, and definitely not to join the United States.
So you mentioned the security threats or the security, you could say, protection of Greenland. What is at stake for Greenland security-wise? Great powers were mentioned, Russia's interest, but how much of room for maneuver does Russia have when it comes to Greenland? How important is Greenland? Or even China, you could say, because, the current administration, they point to the ships that are not even there. What are the risks? What is the situation?
I guess objectively, from NATO strategy originally, Greenland is of course known due to the GI-UK gap, which is sort of from the strategy perspective an important area to monitor. It has been monitored successfully the entire Cold War. There is no reason why it wouldn't be functioning exactly the same today. Danish law forbids to place nuclear weapons on Danish territory during peacetime. That is probably a thing that Denmark and the United States could sort out between themselves, or with Greenland for that matter. During the Cold War, this was done in secret. That is not an issue either, I guess. Russian submarines probably can be monitored. Now, the Danish intelligence report from 2025 indicated that China also has interest in deploying submarines in the future. I don't think it has been done yet. And, how is it different from Russian submarines? In terms of Chinese icebreakers, the last time that the Chinese research icebreaker Xuelong has been near the coast of Greenland was in 2018 during the 9th expedition. Ever since then, most of Chinese activity was closer to Alaska than to Greenland. If anything, the United States should probably focus on their own Alaskan interests. Has lost its only research icebreaker because the current administration cut funding for science. So I don't see how that adds up with the narrative that you need to stop Chinese research icebreakers from entering Greenlandic waters.
And to follow up on what Erdem says, I think it's important to recognize that the Arctic is such a vast area, right? It's such a big part of the planet, basically. So when we're talking about Arctic security and Chinese and Russian ships all over the place, you need to be specific about which part of the Arctic you're talking about. And as Erdem is saying, Alaska is where you're seeing increased Chinese activity. Russia operates in the European part of the Arctic, not Greenland. Greenland is not part of the European Arctic. Greenland is part of the North American Arctic, but on the eastern side, right? Look at the map, please. And then just look at the distances that we're talking about. The main threat, security threat, that it links to Greenland is airborne, coming from Russia, coming from the Kola Peninsula or Franz Josef Land or further in Russia. And this airborne threat could be ballistic missiles, it could be Russian bombers, it could be other types of things coming flying. But this is managed, more or less managed by the Pitufik space base that the US already has. It's also the reason why the US has a space base on the western side of Greenland. We could argue perhaps that Greenland and or the US, or perhaps Greenland jointly or the Kingdom of Denmark jointly with Canada and the US should invest more in NORAD capacities that could detect and take out potential threats. Trump is talking about this golden dome to protect the North American homeland. Perhaps there's an argument for more investments in detection and threat-reducing capacities in that part of Greenland. But beyond that, you don't see an immediate security threat. You could also argue that maybe in the short to medium term, you would see more commercial sailings, that you would see more interest in fisheries, etc., around Greenland to some extent. This could be managed by Coast Guard capacities or by surveillance capacities. You don't need 6,000 troops on Greenland like the US had during the start of the Cold War.
So speaking of troops on Greenland, I want to make you guys do what scientists hate to do the most. Speculate and talk about not what we know, but what we don't know, the future, what could happen. I'm pretty sure both of you have had this practice already by some journalists. So, I hope this is nothing new, but if it is, then it's good practice. So what can happen now? Let's say the US has the legal or let's say the US has the ability internally to go and get Greenland. Let's say they manage to get past Congress somehow, everything is flowing fine. They're going to Greenland. Is this the end for NATO? Is this changing the Arctic security landscape forever? Or is it not? Is this sending some signals to Russia? Is it not? What is happening?
Okay, if we try to speculate. I mean, the most realistic alternative or scenario, if the US is actually able to use force, then would be to take control of nuke, or you take control of key functions in nuke. The government office, the police Arctic command, which is the Kingdom of Denmark's military command in nuke. You take control of these, and you do it with special forces, and you do it rather quickly, probably without much of a resistance. At least that would be the hope, that no one is died or is killed in such an operation. And then the question is, what happens after? Right? There must be a counter response from European countries. The Kingdom of Denmark probably would not declare war against the United States. I think that's probably not seen as the most logical or smart option. But such a move by the United States will completely destroy trust between European countries and the US. We can't then be certain that the US would come to our rescue in Finnmark or on Svalbard if something were to happen with Russia. And every other European country would be thinking the same. NATO, the organizational structure of NATO wouldn't collapse that day, but basically the trust that NATO is based on and the fact that NATO is an organization meant to keep the US engaged in European security means that NATO inherently would cease to function, at least in a proper way. And European countries, probably North European countries, the Nordic countries, the UK, France, Germany, would find their own mechanism to provide a mutual security guarantee to each other, at least. I think that would be the immediate solution. We would probably still have American troops in Norway, the same with many of our other neighbors. These probably won't be kicked out immediately, but I assume then that over a time span of a couple of years, we would slowly but surely disconnect from the US in terms of at least direct security cooperation. Maybe we'd still have to rely on the US in some ways. F-35s are dependent on updates from the US, etc. But we still would have to find some way of decoupling, not entirely probably, but to some extent, to a greater extent than what we have today. And then in substance for the US, instead we have to find something else to rely on.
And now a bit more to the probably a little bit more realistic scenario, hopefully the more realistic scenario, the diplomatic consequences. Let's say the United States does not go in military, but they put significant pressure on Denmark, as they already have. What would this pressure look like? What could possible solutions be from this pressure? What would Denmark have to do? What's your analysis, your takes? And anything goes, nobody knows.
Building up on what Andreas said, I guess this is a less pessimistic scenario. In any case, it would have quite a lot of effect on American power. And the United States has always had enormous soft power abroad, and it was based on the notion that the United States has so many allies. Such diplomatic pressure would still influence American soft power to a great extent, and it would also set precedents in international law generally. So the thing that I'm thinking about immediately is the Taiwan contingency, which the United States has always been quite aware of. China has always said that it wishes to pursue a reunification of the entire country, which means also the Republic of China. And it will probably mean that China will put more diplomatic pressure, but also perhaps more direct, hard pressure on Taiwan.
And what Erdem is saying here is important, right? It's the ripple effect from this. If you even disregard direct military force by the US to get Greenland, if you just see a US that continues to uphold pressures and then maybe even place sanctions on Denmark or find other ways to try to push the Danish government into some form of accommodation, then the ripple effect will influence Chinese relations with Taiwan. It would influence how Russia sees its room for maneuver towards the Baltic states, towards Moldova, towards Georgia, even towards Svalbard, close to where we're sitting right now. It will basically influence the way we see power being used in the international system. And that's really the scary aspect of this that I'm assuming that the Donald Trump administration has not thought through completely, because there's a reason why the US has spent all the money and the resources in upholding the international system, because it benefits, all of us, but it benefits the US first and foremost. And in this power world where the only thing that matters is that you're bigger than your neighbor, then that's going to cause a lot of disruption and a lot of interest also for American citizens and for US status abroad.
So if you could give one policy recommendation, so one of you can give a policy recommendation to Denmark and the other one to the United States. You will choose which is which yourself. What would it be?
Well, I'll choose the United States. Don't do it. Let it be is my answer.
But he needs a win, right? Yeah. Donald Trump needs a win that he can sell on his home turf. So you have to do something. That goes to Denmark, right? So Denmark needs to give him, the Kingdom of Denmark needs to give him a victory, right? That doesn't need to be the loss of sovereignty over Greenland, but it could be a deal that says that the Kingdom of Denmark, together with Nordic allies, perhaps will increase further activity in managing security threats in the Arctic. And the US will have or US companies will have preferential treatment to certain mineral projects. And on top of that, they can give him one of these red rubies that they extract in Greenland, right? Engrave his name or something to convince him, that this is a good agreement for him, because he also needs a way out, I assume, after having spent more than a year now talking about the US needing control over Greenland. So you need to give him the notion of control, even if it's not a reality.
Thank you both. It's been great to have you. I feel I've learned lots, at least. Thank you. And thank you for listening.